Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to be focused today on diversity, speaking specifically about cultural humility, what that means, where it comes from, and how we can apply the tenets of cultural humility to our everyday lives. We approach the discussion through a lens of public health and wellness and the many components that could contribute to an individual's health, the collective health, the health of the community. We hope to find common ground and encourage and facilitate understanding for one another. It is my great honor to introduce our guest panelists today. First is Kip Holley. He's a social research associate at the Ohio State Kirwin Institute for Race and Ethnicity. Kip conducts research on topics related to the structures at the foundation, civic engagement, and public participation, and how they produce radicalized outcomes. He works with community-facing organizations to develop equitable civic engagement strategies and outcomes, and facilitates trainings and workshops related to equitable civic engagement and cultural humility in organization and community interactions. In his 8 years as an associate of Kirwin, Kip has strived to bring a greater understanding of how racial inequity plays a part in creating the environment in which we engage in public decision-making. Kip has obtained a BS in City and Regional Planning and an MSW from Ohio State University. And this multidisciplinary background has helped to inform the intersectional lens through which he understands the civic engagement environment. It is his hope that by gaining a greater understanding of how inequitable civic engagement practices lead to inequitable policies, community members can work together in new ways to develop more equitable policies that ensure everyone has an opportunity to succeed. Thank you for being here, Kip. Mr. Ben Arthurs is a New Albany High School English teacher who has developed the first of its kind class on social and a social justice curriculum at New Albany High School. The curriculum he will talk more about today is largely project-based learning centered around social constructs and anthropology. Representing the New Albany High School NAACP Youth Unit, we have here today Rena Smith and Victoria Mabata. They are co-vice presidents. The vision statement of the NAACP is to ensure a society in which all individuals have equal rights and there is no racial hatred or racial discrimination. The mission is to inform the problems affecting minorities, which includes all people of color. Future leaders are developed within this club and prompt an appreciation for people of color's contribution to civilization. Currently, the group has 30 members, and this is their first year in operation. The New Albany High School Black Student Association, the president is Carter Miner, who is here with us today. The club allows all students to learn about Black culture and history through various fun activities. The club will serve as a safe space for Black students to connect with one another and share challenges that they face as a minority student. The club will host interactive discussions that aim to inform New Albany High School student body on the daily issues that Black people face and aims to bridge students with similar and different racial experiences together. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Well, we're going to jump in because we have so many topics to cover here, and I know we won't get to them all. So Kip, first, can you tell us a little bit about what you do at the Kirwan Institute for the study of race and ethnicity?
Yes. I want to make sure I'm not too loud on the microphone. So at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University, I'm a research associate, and I specialize in the sort of intersection between race and racial inequities and civic and community engagement. So basically how those inequalities that we talk about in structures and in law and in other areas of policy play out in sort of how we come together and make decisions in communities that in some spaces are more diverse and in some spaces are less diverse. And cultural humility is one of the tools that we talk about in terms of getting people to sort of approach diversity from curiosity by using those sort of tenets that Dr. Garcia and Dr. Turbalong talked about. So that's it.
Perfect. The cultural competence was originally designed as part of the clinical and medical setting, including a multicultural training of physicians and clinical staff. This was designed to improve the delivery of healthcare. Can you talk a little bit about this and where it came from?
Sure. So as the doctors talked about in the video, cultural humility kind of came out of this idea of wanting to I've seen that cultural competence was just not enough, right? That, even though cultural competence classes and activities have been around in the medical field at that point, I believe, for decades, they still had these challenges, right, that they talked about in the video, where you would have people working from cultural competence with the best of intentions, but still not understanding patients coming from diverse backgrounds, not being, and sort of superseding what they were learning about their patients from patients with cultural competence. And so they kind of saw in their Los Angeles hospitals that more was sort of needed because they were having more and more diverse patients coming in. And so they started to sort of develop these ideals around what we know today about cultural humility. It's sort of like, how can we sort of create a practice where our medical professionals are listening to people talk about their identities, talk about their truths, and talk about their lives and their challenges, and kind of go from that information first and learn from that information first, and kind of understand how sometimes their power imbalances from the doctor-patient relationship, but also sort of racial and social identities were kind of getting in the way of that. And that's when they started to sort of develop these sort of tenets of cultural humility.
Can you talk specifically about those tenets that make up cultural humility?
Yeah. So cultural humility, like I said in the video, is made up of 3 tenets. And it's really kind of why I like this approach as well, because overall cultural humility really kind of changes the way that we think about approaching culture. When you think about like cultural humility, we want to think about, oh, it's about being more humble. I'll try to be more humble. Just like I'll try to be more kind at the grocery store when somebody has stolen my spot or something like that. And it's a very emotional thing. But the way they talk about it, it's really kind of an effective thing. It's about actions leading to behavior change. And those actions really kind of start with that piece of critical self-reflection and lifelong learning. And I don't want to belabor the point because I'll be able to come back to it. But basically, it's kind of how can we approach diversity, not from something to be afraid of or something to sort of, tamp down or ignore, but something we can approach with curiosity through approaching it as a learning experience. And by being reflective about our feelings and experiences, even and especially when they're uncomfortable, when we're uncomfortable talking about certain topics related to race or certain topics related to diversity in general. And that leads into sort of the second tenet is sort of understanding power imbalances and basically how our various identities, some of us have identities that are marginalized and identities that are privileged within our current society. And being able to be reflexive about our approach to diversity based on those identities and what we've learned from those identities and being in those identities, and maybe how other people with identities may be having different relationships with diversity and that kind of thing. And then finally, institutionalizing these in our norms is really about, instead of just taking these practices something like, I'll do that when I can, how can we make these things a part of our daily lives in institutions such as schools or hospitals or nonprofits or anywhere we would come? How can we make this practice something that we do every day? And when we do these kind of practices every day, according to sort of cultural humility, we get better at moving closer to diversity and being able to have a wider appreciation of diversity.
Mm-hmm. And that's what kind of struck me. So just studying cultural competence as it relates to cultural humility, I began to realize that it seems like it's functional to use kind of as a framework for discussing race and diversity just in layman's life. It doesn't have to be just applied to the clinical or the medical setting. Would you agree that it is functional in that capacity?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that we wanted to do at Kirwan and that we've done in some of our work is sort of, take these principles, which can really be used anywhere, and try to move them into different discussions, like about sort of community activities or community approaches to, say, safety or health, those things. And the funny thing is that those principles tend to already kind of be present, but maybe we don't have a name for them, and maybe we don't have sort of a box for them sometimes. And cultural humility is sometimes a way to point out kind of things and say, like, hey, this is something that is critical self-reflection. Maybe we can do more of that. Maybe we can find a way to expand that and things like that.
Exactly. And I think this is a great opportunity to bring in Mr. Arthurs to talk a little bit about just the work that you're doing with the social justice class and the curriculum that you're developing, and essentially how we can apply those same thoughts and ideas to the school and the environment.
Sure. Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for having us, Angela, and for putting this on. This is really important work, and for including the students, because as you will hear me say multiple times today, that from my point of view as an educator, we need to listen to the students much more. We need to give them a voice. We need to amplify their voice. We need to amplify their experience, be temperate and humble with their experience, and make sure that education is as equitable as possible. So the starting of my course, when we pulled the plug on school on March 13th, 2020, that was about the same time that George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, amongst others, the Black Lives Matter movement caught a lot of traction. I know it's older than 2020, but it got a lot of coverage in the media. And as Kip was saying, some of us have identities that are marginalized, and other of us have identities that are privileged. And as a white male, and as Dr. Hassan Jeffries from the Ohio State University, he's been working closely with New Albany schools, he always advocates to explain who you are and what you are. So my name is Ben Arthurs, and I'm a white male. That means something. That means that I have baggage, I have privilege, I have eccentricities to myself. And so with that privilege, what can I control in my 20 square feet? What am I good at? Where can I make a difference in my community? In addition to being an educator in New Albany, I'm also a resident. So making sure that New Albany's community is as 21st century culturally competent as possible. I felt obligated to make something happen because a lot of the students marginalized for whatever reason, whether they are pink-haired or part of the LGBTQI community, wearing a hijab to school, or a student of color, or students in special ed services. Those students tend to flock to me because they know that the rapport that I develop with them over time is special, it's sincere, and it's genuine. So these students know that they can count on me. And so during this time that we had off, I was brainstorming, worked closely with a former assistant principal, Amy Warren, and I asked her how quickly would it be to get a course approved for the fall, and she said it would take about a year, and I said, we've got 3 months, so let's get this going, because the time is now. The idea of being a performative ally, which I'm sure we'll unpack later, I was just tired of being complacent, and so I created a course. I went through sociology and anthropology syllabi from my colleagues at Columbus State, at the Ohio State University, and at Miami University. I pulled reading lists together, and we here at New Albany, we have hosted from the Buck Institute, the project-based learning, or also known as PBL, Institute in coaching. And so I've gone up through the ranks and become certificated in all of those classes that they offered. PBL is a great way to design a course for student-centered learning. You start off with a common understanding. So for example, with my class Synergy, we looked at microaggressions, we looked at patriarchy, we looked at white supremacy. We really turned the lens on what does it mean to be white in America, because too often, from my point of view, too often the conversation on race is pointed at the victims to solve it. And I believe that more white people should be involved and be not just performative allies and retweet that tweet, but really to take actionable steps to have goals that are mitigated and vetted by the people that are around you, so that we can take these actionable steps to make something happen. So we ran it as a pilot last year. We had 11 students take it, and another part of project-based learning is the presentation at the end to a real-world audience. We had it catered by Freedom a la carte. One of my students did her project on sex trafficking. And so Freedom a la carte hires people who have been victims of sex trafficking. We invited superintendents, Board of Education members, colleagues, staff, students, parents. It was an excellent turnout, and everybody got to share their research. Other notable research projects was, what is it like to be a Black man in America? Native Indian American rights. We looked at Black birth givers and the infant mortality rate, which is despicable at this point in time. And amongst others, we did teenage health, mental health in schools. So it was a great outlet for these students to have a common understanding, look at what social justice and social injustices are, have that common vocabulary, and then move forward with their essential questions on what they wanted to pursue. So it was really fantastic. And this year we're going to be offering it again, second semester, and I'm still recruiting some students. So if you're out there watching, Arthur's.5 at APLS.
That's awesome work.
Yeah, and Carter is one of the students who was enrolled in my course last year, so I'm sure he can talk about some of that later. But thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to hit on health equity later. We can't do that right this moment. But I do want to say, with cultural humility, we want an understanding of one another's culture, and we want to talk about our heritage and history, but I think that's only half the story. And I know, Kip, you and I talked a little bit about this. It's really important to focus on and call out that there are marginalized, underserved minority populations. So it's not just the same as celebrating someone's Irish heritage or English heritage. You have to recognize that the other side of the coin is that the other half of the story is that those minority underserved groups, really, you have to focus your attention there. You have to be honest and inquisitive about that. So would you want to comment a little bit about those power dynamics and the identities that people have, knowingly or unknowingly?
Yeah, I think going from that conversation, like the way we basically put it was that it's impossible to really appreciate cultures, especially cultures, or experiences for people who are living with identities that are marginalized without being able to recognize that marginalization and the part we play. If we're not willing to recognize that, then we're not really appreciating that culture or appreciating what people are offering in that culture. So there's more to sort of appreciating diversity than just saying, like, I like these aspects of diversity. I like this artwork, or I like this way of dancing, or this way of singing, or I like this way of talking, or what have you. It really, in order to really appreciate diversity in that way, that will make people feel appreciated. We also have to appreciate, the role that marginalization plays in the way people are living, in the creation of that art, in the creation of all of that stuff. When we talk about that a lot with African American culture and appropriation. There are a lot of people who appreciate the fruits of Black culture, but don't really appreciate the creators or the circumstances in which that art has had to be appreciated. And that's really when we're coming at power dynamics. That's one example of it. It's the power that some of our identities give us to consume art without having to think about the artist, say, or their circumstances, versus having to create art in a space where you are probably going to be marginalized and your art can be taken, maybe without even you having much of a say about it, even though you're the artist. And a lot of that comes with the identities that people hold in terms of race, socioeconomic status, LGBTQIA status, all of everything that we've been talking about so far. All of those identities are given different power valences by this social and structural inequality in our society. And so if I'm coming into these spaces with identities that through media, through stories, through the interactions that I have every day, through things like microaggressions, which we were talking about before, you know, a power relationship already exists, whether or not I personally as a person would like it to exist. I imagine that most of us would not like it to exist, but they do. And so it's important for us to be able to recognize where we sit, especially in that power relationship based off of our identities, and be able to be honest about it, just like, you know, you were talking about just a moment ago, you know, and be honest about what our identities are, you know, and if in you know, to the extent that they're privileged, how they privilege us. And especially this is true, I think in spaces where some of us may be dealing with identities that are both in some identities that are marginalized and others not. You know, I'm a Black man in America, which means I am Black in America, and I'm also a man in a patriarchal society. I'm also an academic, and I'm also middle class, and so you get a lot of those identities together, and I have some things that I'm looking at from the space of being marginalized, and some things I'm looking at from being privileged. And understanding, you know, when I'm talking to somebody or when somebody is discussing me, or I'm trying to learn more about someone, where I sit in that power relationship, I think is important to be able to really have that kind of authentic relationship where people are feel comfortable sharing their diversity with me on their own terms. And I think that's important to build those kind of relationships.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear from the students here next as well. And I think we talked a little bit about this, Kip, when you and I talked, and just really taking the next step and saying, yes, there are privilege and power imbalances, and also there are assumptions based on ethnicity. Those assumptions, you know, systematic racism chooses some as inherently positive and some as inherently negative. And I mean, you almost have to just say it that simply to understand that really there are big assumptions based on your ethnicity and all of these other factors that you listed. And what does that mean for each of us? And the students, if there was something you would like to comment or share just in your experiences.
I think I can speak for everybody when I say that a lot of times, especially as a kid, we come across stereotypes that that some people see as good, that are like, oh, well, this is a good thing. But it's at the end of the day, it's still a stereotype, and those things really impact you because it's something that you are grouped into that you might not even fit in, and it forces you to change the way you think about yourself, because even if it's a good thing, and it's not always a good thing, it's a lot of the times it's bad things that you're grouped into that you don't even connect with, and I think that's the big problem that comes from things like that, ascribed statuses that you don't hold to.
I want to say, with stereotyping is that, but with a big portion of being a Latina, it's a lot of stereotyping within like the Hispanic community in general as well. It's like sometimes that you're supposed to act a certain way or dress a certain way. And typically the stereotype is kind of like Latinos are more revealing or kind of like more like kind of like portrayed as sexy and stuff like that. A lot of people I know that are Hispanic are not like that, and some people are and some people not, but it's always at that one stereotype that you're tied to, even though it's nothing like you are. And then like another one is people coming up and assuming where you're from. Like I know a lot of people will come up to me saying I'm Mexican, which I'm not, and thinking that we all look like some certain way. Like especially versus lighter versus darker Hispanics, like people assume that they're all just one and the same, and that's not true at all.
So like my mother always told me, she always says to judge a person and don't judge a person before you know them. And you have to get to know someone before you can ever make an inferred topic or a stereotype on them. So I think that's important for someone to learn, or everyone to learn, that you can't really pay attention to what anyone else says about any type of person. You kind of have to learn from them yourself, and then maybe you'll see, oh, hey, not all people act like this, or you'll get to defeat the point of stereotypes, and it kind of gets rid of it. I feel like if you actually try to learn someone and learn their culture. So I think that's really important.
Thank you, absolutely. And I know in speaking with each of you kind of in advance, all of you independently talked about microaggressions. So I think it would be important if we could just share maybe your perspective, your experience with them, what it is, how it impacts your life, how it impacts this discussion.
I think we've all, of course, the majority of us on the panel have experienced microaggressions. A big one that I think I run into a lot is especially this is last year with my name. A teacher would never get my name right in class, and assumed my name was the name of a different Black student that wasn't even in my class. It was a different class, and I think that's something that I did not know what that was called at the time, even when I was a freshman, and I had to go home and my mom had to explain it to me. And I think that's something that happens a lot with kids even younger. They're having microaggressions and having discrimination, and they don't know what it's called because it's not being taught in school. And something that I think came up this year especially was that as a Black child, we don't get to decide when we learn about racism, and white kids get that privilege. They get to learn about it in school, but a lot of times when Black people learn about racism, it's when it's done to them, when something racist happens to them. And so I think that's something that really I connect to, that I didn't get to decide when I learned about racism. My brother didn't get to decide. I'm sure you guys didn't get to decide either. And I think that's a big thing that is really impacting students. I think that's why we need to learn so young about what things are called, what is happening, so that you know when someone's wrong, because it's a horrible thing that happens to such young kids.
I also have a thing with the name. I feel like that's a really big problem with people who have like unique names nowadays. Because like I'll have lots of like different pronunciations of my name come up with teachers trying to learn how to say it. And several times they're just like, they just spit a ton of different like pronunciations out and just say, oh, well, I'll get it later next time. And it's just like, I didn't realize that at first when I was little. And then now I look back at it and I'm like, I wish they would have made an effort so I didn't feel self-conscious about my name, because it does hurt you when it's like, it feels like they can't pronounce like who you are correctly, and like kind of takes away from your identity at sometimes. And especially because like, I don't know, it like that the uniqueness is your name, that you are unique, and that's what should come across, instead of just trying to brush over it and say you'll get it right next time, or just not address it at all.
So I feel like with microaggressions, they're very, or at least in my experience, they're very secretive, and like it's not out there, but it's kind of, you're like, oh, she said that, or oh, now that like you kind of don't realize it until it happens. And like I'll say a story. Like I know, like I went to the doctor's office with my sister, and she was concerned about her health, to get like healthy, and the doctor was like, well, do you eat a lot of fried foods? Do you eat like fried chicken? And we were like, hold up, wait, what did she just say? And we didn't really say anything because it was like me and my sister, we were younger, but my mom's like, no, we're not gonna do this right now. And so you kind of don't really, like Carter said, you don't know until it happens to you. And I think it's just really important to discuss it and tell people like what's wrong and what's right, just because you don't know you hurt someone until it happens. And once you do something, you can't really get rid of it. So it stays in the person's mind or the victim's mind. So I think it's really important to learn about it and to, just learn.
I'd like to piggyback on the idea, especially from an educator's point of view. At the beginning of the year, in a couple of weeks now, I'm going to have to get to know and to memorize about 150 names. Names as identity are so very important, especially to our young learners, our young adults. And we had one student in my Synergy class who was an African immigrant. Her parents were, and they moved to Texas, and her name was difficult for me to pronounce. but I worked at it, and she knew I was trying, and it kind of became a running joke that I couldn't do it. So it was, again, establishing that rapport that I was not mispronouncing it on purpose. There was actually an inflection in the middle of a 5-syllable name that I wasn't getting right. And so but I made a concerted effort to get her name right over and over and over again, because there's a certain amount of shame and lack of respect when you don't get a student's name right. And so just to value that and to try, especially I'm speaking as a white person to the white audience, either in the room or watching online. We started off my course by listening to a podcast. If you're not familiar with Scene on Radio, SCENE, Scene on Radio, John B. Ewan and Chenjerai Kumudike started a series called Seeing White, and they turned the lens on, again, what does it mean to be white? So it's a great podcast. I learned more from 14 episodes than I did in a lot of history classes that I took in college. It was a really eye-opener for me. It's put on by Duke University, so it's highly vetted. But again, this idea of valuing and respecting another human's name is just simply the right thing to do. To avoid it, to continually mispronounce it, to call by somebody else's name is extremely disrespectful. And I think that as educators and as just generic white people, we need to do better to respect those things.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add, in terms of microaggressions is, just such great examples already been set, is expanding to that to sort of microaggressions that are, I feel like they're benign in the way that they're carried, which is most microaggressions. But, microaggressions around achievement, and it's particularly achievement in Blackness, but also just brown people in general. My example of that is, when I was going to Ohio State and getting my bachelor's in urban planning, a regular conversation that I had with people would say, like, "You're an urban planner?" And I would get congratulated for, being in urban planning, like, "Oh, there's not a lot of Black people in urban planning. It's great that you're in urban planning." And, it was like there was a party for me at being in urban planning. And I was like, I'm just a student in urban planning. And, people would come up and tell me about statistics and talk about, like, there aren't a lot of Black people in urban planning. A lot of people don't, graduate from the program. And I think that was meant to sort of spur me on, but it was really uncomfortable. And I think also along that line, another thing that I've heard from, people, and particularly my friends and I, my generation, is this idea of equating Blackness or brownness with expertise in racial equity matters. I happen to be a Black person who is somewhat of an expert, or at least is called an expert, but I have plenty of friends who are not, who get many of the same questions that I do, and they're like, I don't know, I just like cooking pasta or something like that, and, also the idea that this is the first topic of conversation that Black and brown people want to talk about, when it may be something completely different, like we were all talking about Ted Lasso and soccer in there, and I was like, that's a conversation I would love to have. I could talk about, Premier League soccer every day, but and a lot of people have a lot of different interests, and to the points that all of you have made is that Black and brown people are not monoliths either. We all people have a lot of different experiences and ideals even within that identity, because we're also living with different identities and experiences within that.
Yeah, the intersectionality.
Exactly. And so a lot of the conversation that we were having around microaggressions and sort of understanding power dynamics is really rooted in this conversation about being self-reflexive and making that time to be reflexive about what our assumptions are when we're seeing a certain amount of identities for people and what we may not know, and then how to handle that and learn more from that and kind of make our apologies and do better as we go.
And I think that's something, Kip, that you kind of helped me with, even as I was approaching these preliminary discussions in advance of today. I had tremendous trepidation because I don't want to say the wrong thing, and my own privilege and my own ignorance would come through and I would feel embarrassed. So, you know, and I said that to you and you said, you know, it's a clumsy conversation and that's okay, you know? So I think just being able to say that and being able to call that out allows us to have these really important conversations, knowing that we're going to try really hard to get it right, but we're surely not going to do it perfectly. And you were really helpful in helping me navigate that.
There's also, to speak to that point, there's no such thing as a perfect ally. It's just impossible. I try my hardest, I do my best, I put as many actionable goals into practice as I can, but inevitably I'm going to screw up and I'm going to say the wrong thing. And the students in Synergy were there to correct me when I did. And we laughed it off because, again, they respected and knew that I was trying, that I was there for them, that I was there for their success, that I was there for their growth. And so that idea that it is a messy conversation, that it is not always going to be perfect. And I think as far as Caucasians go, we need to be okay to sit in the discomfort. It's really important that we recognize with radical acceptance that we have some really trepidatious race problems in this country. And it's not about white fragility. It's not about white guilt. It's just sitting at the table and being a good listener and understanding and having tolerance and competence for what other people are going through that look different from you. So as long as you can be recognized as somebody who's willing to sit in that discomfort and radically accept that whether you believe it or not, we have a race problem in this country. And so again, I hear what you're saying. There's no such thing as a perfect ally. It's impossible to do.
I would like to add on to what you were saying. In society, a lot we've been taught that you can't be wrong when you're in a conversation. You have to always be right, and being scared to make mistakes really gets in the way of change. And that's something that we learned from those podcasts. That's one of the things that they were really pushing, is that you need to make the effort and you need to be able to make mistakes and grow from them, because that's the only way you can grow. That's something that kids, we are constantly making mistakes, and you guys did it too. As teenagers, I think it's our biggest job a lot of times is to make mistakes so we can learn from them. And that's what, as an ally, you need to show that you're making an effort. And you did make mistakes in Synergy. Of course. But you grew from it.
I was labeled mayonnaise man halfway through the
well, you know, sometimes we make mistakes as well. But you've been willing to make those mistakes, and just in general, making mistakes is really helpful to growing as a community and as a person. And I think that's something that you really need to push out there, is that a lot of times we're too scared to make mistakes and to fail, but failing is the biggest help that you can get.
Thank you. I asked Kip when we kind of had this discussion, like, how do we answer this? You know, how do we reflect on this journey with diversity, and what do we do, and how can we do it? And you listed a few bullet points, which I think are really important just to call out, because I need like a list, like, okay, I'm going to do these things. We should commit to active engagement in the lifelong learning process. We should approach with humble curiosity, walking towards these discussions, and don't demand that someone from a certain group talk about their culture in an all-white group, for example. Reflection and introspection, community-based care and advocacy, emphasis and acknowledgement of the marginalized group, recognizing and advocating for them, and then race-affirming practices, valuing diversity, diverse workplace environments, minority representation. Did I miss anything? Would you add?
I was going to say, no, you didn't. I was also going to thank you for writing down those bullets, because I would not have remembered all of them.
Yes, no problem. I want to switch gears a little bit. I think just to kind of touch base about and give Ben the opportunity to maybe debunk some misconceptions and talk about the critical race theory in education, because I know that's certainly a hot topic right now. This is obviously not an endorsement, but just an opportunity to consider it objectively.
She went there. Okay. critical race theory, we have to back up. Before we talk about critical race theory, we have to talk about something called literary theory. For those who don't understand what theory is, it is a specific lens in which we analyze a thing. One of the oldest literary theories out there is called hermeneutics. It first started in the interpretation of the Bible. And hermeneutics basically states that we all have our own unique sets of experiences, and we bring those to the table as we interpret a piece of literature. So let's say a love poem, a sonnet by Shakespeare. If you are recently in love, you will read this poem this way. If you've just been through a divorce, you will read the poem this way. If you've been through a positive divorce, you will read it this way, right? So based on your sets of experience, your human experience, you will interpret a work that way. So it is a specific lens. It is not the you, it is not the self-interpreting, it's interpreting through a lens. There are many other literary theories out there. There's queer theory, where you are looking at the lens of LGBTQIA. I wrote a paper at Ohio State using queer theory, analyzing Lion King, looking at the possibility of homosexuality between Timon and Pumbaa. I got an A on the paper. The idea is not saying that I'm a homosexual or that necessarily the cartoon characters were homosexual. It was using that lens to analyze a certain piece of work. There's post-colonial theory, which looks at literature that is everything after the post-colonial movement from Africa. So critical race theory came from the 70s and the 80s. It is held widely in academia, which means in the college and university level. And it was looked at in law specifically to look at systemic racism and look at how Black and brown people have been treated differently in the scope of our American history. So when you look at things like gerrymandering, it's huge, and Ohio is one of the absolute worst at it. And the way that the board is set up right now, I think they have 5 Republicans and 2 Democrats, and they either vote on a shared map that is redone, and that stands for 10 years, or they don't agree on it, and the Republicans can pass, or the Democrats, whoever is in power at the time, can pass it, and it will last for 4 years. So that's what has just recently been done, literally within the last couple of weeks. If you don't know what gerrymandering it is creating crazy maps to make sure that that electorate wins that election again. We look at voter suppression, we look at voting rights, we look at all of these things that have systemically oppressed certain people of certain skin colors and skin tones. Looking at bank loans, looking at FHA loans, federal housing loans, looking at Latino and Blacks are the most denied when it comes to mortgage loans and FHA loans. And so critical race theory, the fact that people think that we are teaching it in the K-12, it's just not happening. There's a difference between truly applying critical race theory and culturally responsive teaching. There's a difference. There's a huge difference. And being a culturally responsive teacher means including the Tuskegee experiment when you're teaching Black History Month. You're just not teaching MLK. You're teaching everything. You're teaching the true history. And so objectively speaking, part of my course was rooted in critical race theory, but it wasn't all critical race theory. We did look at patriarchy. I'm a man. I had to own up on some of that stuff. We had to look at the idea of white supremacy and white leadership in the history of our country. There's that one great meme that went out a while ago of 46 pictures of white men as vice presidents, and then Kamala Harris right there to break the norm. And that is substantial. And so even though the class had some tendencies of CRT, it is not that. It just had components of it. So again, when you're truly teaching critical thinking, you should come at it from multiple lenses, not just from a CRT lens, but from multiple lenses. So thank you for bringing it up. And I'm sure you can speak to that on the college level more than I can.
Too many mics. I really actually don't have, that was really pat, and fluid understanding of race theory. And I don't have much to add other than to, just kind of bounce off of and amplify, what you were talking about in terms of teaching, to look at the history of any racial group in this country is to veer into some aspect of critical race theory, because we are highlighting the experiences of different groups of people in the story of the United States and the history of the United States that often don't get highlighted. And the very act of highlighting that is something that critical race theory does as a part of its focusing its lens on a racial history of the United States. And given that we have a history of, enforced legal segregation, chattel slavery, various immigration challenges, and horrible immigration laws, Native American, extermination in terms of westward expansion. When you put all that together, it's really difficult to, if people wanted to have a curriculum that was purely devoid of critical race theory or any aspect of it, to really do that without even teaching history as most people have been teaching it for years. I mean, I learned most of the stuff that we were talking about in my history classes over the last 20 or 30 years. So I think, that aspect has to really be highlighted, is that a lot of the things that a lot of American history that is just troublesome to think about is, emotionally difficult to imagine or confront, is important history. And it has been important history, and it will continue to be important history that we'll have to learn even more about. And I think the more that we're centering these experiences of people who have been traditionally marginalized and left out of the history, I think that's the kind of clumsy work, I suppose, when you're talking about that we can all learn from. We can all become more comfortable at coming to grips with that history and how it's played a part in our lives today. And that might help us appreciate that diversity and multiculturalism even more.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about cognitive dissonance. Can you expand on that a little for me?
Sure. So cognitive dissonance, and I'm really just going to give a thumbnail sketch, definition, is sort of the practice of, when we encounter information that is difficult for us to hear or that we don't want to process emotionally or otherwise, is sort of the sort of mental and emotional process of rejecting that information. So, in the example that we were talking about with history, if I hear about the Tuskegee experiment, or if I hear about, redlining and racially segregating housing practices, and how that has led to historical, poverty and wealth robbery amongst Black people in America, say, and I'm like, that's difficult to hear because, my family was involved in real estate in the city for a long time. And I like to think of them as good people. And these two pictures don't necessarily match up. And I would rather keep the picture that's more comfortable. Cognitive dissonance is the sort of process of rejecting that information, usually through some sort of rhetorical device. Well, that history must be biased, or the people who are saying that have a different agenda, or some way to discredit this new information that makes me uncomfortable, or that does not reconcile with the picture that I already have. And, just as these examples are put, cognitive dissonance plays a part in sort of impeding this process of being able to sort of understand and come to grips with racial inequities within America by sort of, from a society standpoint, giving us a lot of sort of outs to do that process. That's where, you know, you have things like fake news or other such things coming up, even about, you know, viruses and vaccines, because also those are, you know, are also things that are uncomfortable for some people to talk about. And a lot of the language that comes around that information and that news are really just sort of societal-based ways of sort of being able to cognitively distance ourselves or practice cognitive dissonance with that information.
Follow up on that. There's, in addition to cognitive dissonance, there's a term that one of my former Black Studies professors at Ohio State used to use, and that was premeditated ignorance. You already know that you don't want to know about a certain type of topic or subject, right? You've made it up in your mind that I'm going to reject, no matter how well vetted, no matter how credible the sources are. People already know that they don't want to learn about a subject. They don't want to grow. And so that's that fixed mindset that, again, we as white people need to overcome that. And it's not easy. And I've put myself on the chopping block in a classroom in front of 10 people or 30 people, or in the grand scope of things, 150 students at a time. And that idea that we as whites need to overcome premeditated ignorance. We need to learn more. I did not learn about the Tuskegee experiment in high school growing up in the 90s. So we as whites need to do a lot of reading. We need to do a lot of soul searching and radically accepting some of these things that have happened, so that they're no longer denied and they're no longer pushed under the rug.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit more about cognitive dissonance is that there's a social aspect to that as well. So sometimes cognitive dissonance around some of these topics happens because of internal sort of embarrassment or discomfort, but also because of societal pressure. So if we are learning and taking in new information about, say, redlining, or taking in new information about sort of criminal justice and racial inequity, and we're like, that's some information I didn't know about before, but people in our social group or in our immediate social group are people who do not like that view and reject that view entirely, and we feel that our own social position or our own friendships may be in danger. We may decide to be coming about that as well. Because of those social pressures as well, even if we don't really know it. We may say like, hey, I just got done watching, the 13th on Netflix, and it's a whole bunch of stuff I didn't know about the prison industrial complex. And they're like, that's all fake and everything like that. And you're like, well, this is a friend of mine. They're important to me. Maybe the stuff that I think I learned, I didn't learn. And that's kind of going along with that sort of predetermined ignorance as well, is that we're choosing cognitive dissonance because we're weighing our friendships and social networks against sort of this new information that may make them uncomfortable.
I was going to add that with both what you said, that a lot of times in school, we aren't taught the hard history that we need to be taught. Like when you did learn about Tuskegee, I haven't learned about that in school. I was taught about that at home. And a lot of times people look at it as like, sometimes you go on the internet and you look up fun facts about some fun history facts, but these are things that truly happened and they're atrocities that need to be taught in school. So there's not something that you have to go out and look for your own. Like, I know it's important to go out and do your own research and look things up, but there's also some things I think that should be required to be taught in school so that kids understand things. I didn't know what Black Wall Street was. I wasn't taught that in school. I learned that at home. I didn't know what Tuskegee was. I wasn't taught that in school. I learned that at home. And I think there's a lot of things like that where those need to be taught in school, and they need to be important in the school. They can't just be something that you throw away. You only spend one day or a day on, or you only talk about during. Yeah, right. You only talk about it during Black History Month. There are things that need to be taught throughout the entire year because it's American history. It's history that needs to be taught.
Just adding to Carter, I think that it's very important for our teachers to teach us or just the curriculum, because I think that when you learn from a mistake, it won't really happen again. And there's so many mistakes that, I mean, society has made throughout time. And I think that if we were to learn from the mistakes that are like the elders have done and everything in the past, that we'll learn to do better and be better, and maybe it'll be less hostile environment. And I think that the learning has to be from everyone, you know, it can't just be one-sided. And I think when you're learning, like I know Black history, like you can't just go to the Black student, you know, you have to go from everyone. You kind of have to get a POV from everyone, and even if it's wrong, then you teach them. You can't just let someone state their opinion and then tell them, oh, this is wrong. You have to let them learn, just so the mistake can be learned from, I guess. Yeah.
And Ben, I know when we talked, you talked a lot about just your passion for finding equity in the schools statewide and nationwide. And, you know, you were really concerned and passionate that a lot of the kids, the Black and the brown kids and the LGBTQ kids, and there's a lot of kids that are really struggling. So I think it's important to just give voice to that and to share your perspective there.
Sure. Yeah. The marginalized students that I've talked to that have come to me feel one of two ways, and please correct me where I'm wrong. They either feel that they have a target on their back, which is unfair to the learning process, or they feel completely ignored and off the radar, which is completely unfair to the learning process. So if Jeff comes in and needs a pencil, sure, it's on the desk, but Jamal comes in and needs a pencil, and why don't you have your stuff? I mean, those microaggressions that happen to students affect their learning process. And so we look at, I mean, we look at our state report card, not just New Albany's, but everyone in the state of Ohio. We have gap closing. We are looking at specific Black and brown students and how can we get them to better achieve on the test. Now, in defense of New Albany's curriculum, we do not teach to the test. What we do is we teach so well that the kids do well on the test, right? I mean, my colleagues and staff in every single department, I cannot speak more highly of. So we don't necessarily teach to the test, but what we do in the 180 days, not just the week before the test, but in the 180 days, we do teach critical thinking. We do teach excellent writing skills and excellent reading skills, scientific and math skills. And even the arts are incredibly important to that well-rounded whole child. But if you have a target on your back because you are transitioning, or because you are nervous about coming out, or because you wear a hijab, or because you have braids in your hair, you are either ignored or you have a target on your back. And that is completely unfair and makes my heart hurt. And again, that's why I'm in the craft that I'm in, is because I want to make a difference and change those things, not just here at the New Albany level, but in Columbus City schools and in Ohio and in the Midwest and nationwide. We have a lot of work to do in education.
Could you talk a little bit about Activists for Justice Coalition?
Oh, sure. Yeah, come on. Yes, the AJC. These young ladies came to me a year ago, right around the time when we were leaving for COVID, and they wanted to celebrate the diversity of the student population at New Albany, and they wanted to do it with kind of benign projects. I mean, we had a pumpkin recycling event, right? So, it wasn't anything lofty. It wasn't anything like that. But they wanted to celebrate cultures, and during Peace Week, something that we celebrate over the last 20 years at New Albany, this is the sad part about the AJC, is that we wanted to have a diversity celebration and have students get up and share parts of their culture. And what my young ladies, students, my young female students found out is that students were embarrassed to share their culture. Students were embarrassed to be picked on, to be targeted, and so they were hesitant and had reservations to share out. So that activity actually never came to fruition because of stigmas and stereotypes that often happen in middle schools, elementary schools, and in high schools. So the AJC is up and running. It's a new club, and I'm excited to be an advisor of it, but I do very little for them. I am only the advisor, and I help there as the adult in the room, but these girls just knock it out of the park every single time that they get involved in something. So yeah, they're a special group.
So we're going to go in very soon to final thoughts and action items. So get ready and geared up for your thoughts on that, because you'll have to give us your plans for how we fix all of this, which of course we don't do. But I think we have to also say, we don't have time to talk about it. I did have it as a topic, but we're not going to be able to get through, of course, health equity and health disparities. But I think we have to at least say before we close, we will have another topic on this. That although the term disparities is often interpreted to mean racial or ethnic disparities, many dimensions of disparity exist in the United States, particularly in health. If a health outcome is seen between populations, there is a disparity. Race or ethnicity, sex, sexual identity, age, disability, socioeconomic status, and geographic location all contribute to an individual's ability to achieve good health. It's important to recognize the impact that these social determinants have on health and the outcomes of specific populations. Again, we could spend weeks on that, but I just have to say, there's a lot of work over the past many decades to describe the very specifics. And one that I have recently read here, actually published at Ohio State, and then through the CDC, there's the disparities that exist and are profound between Blacks and whites. There are decades of research across all ages, ethnicities, and socioeconomic status. Compared to whites, Black Americans receive less overall health care and have a lower life expectancy, more than double the rate of infant mortality, and higher death rates from a multitude of health threats, including pregnancy, related complications, cancer, homicide, and COVID-19. So health equity and disparity exists. We need to keep talking about that. Sadly, we don't have the time today, but I at least wanted to say that and call that out. So as we move forward to talk about final thoughts and action items, we always like to close with kind of, how we move forward. And I think first and foremost, I expressed even to you, Kit, my frustration with what can we be doing? And your response to me, really, it was a great quote. I should just find it. We are changeable and adaptable, you said. And just because we want to get better at diversity, a few simple steps can move us in that direction. And there is progress in that journey. Someone looking inward and trying to make change, this is a victory, moving us towards racial equity. And that was really special to me because I really want to make change, but I realize it's a long, 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 long road. So having you share that insight with me was really important. So there is value just in this discussion, and I certainly recognize that. So thank you all for that. So for our communities, what can we be doing better? Our teachers, our parents, our community leaders, where do we go from here? How do we create tangible action? What comes to mind? Anyone?
Give it to the kid.
I think to go back to what you said in your quote, a lot of times there's the road to equality in the egalitarian society, something we learned in Synergy. And a lot of times there are walls that are built right in front of us to stop us from moving forward. But these conversations build excellence and make us master climbers and help us get over that wall. And I think that as we move forward, we need to continue to have these conversations. And as a community, I think these conversations really invigorate us and help us move forward together because we're all here and we're wanting to learn and we want to move forward. I think in schools, something that needs to be done, and I've said this before, even in this conversation, is transparency and being able to make mistakes. I know I ran into some problems this year with the administration, with things that happened that I think could have been handled differently, but I think what needs to continue to happen is respect. It doesn't matter the different views that are in the room, but if you continue to have respect for each other, movement will happen. And I think that's the big thing and the big takeaway. And my final thought would be, from my club standpoint with the Black Student Association, we want to foster growth, not just in our students, not in the teachers, not just in the administration, but in the entire community. And we want to hold conversations. So we held conversations with Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who's a Harvard professor, and he talked about activism. We held conversations with Michelle Alexander, who wrote The New Jim Crow. And we continue to have those conversations to talk about big topics from the student level, from the student's perspective, so that teachers and administrations can hear what we're thinking, and hopefully that they decide that they want to make a change because it's in their best interest too, because they'll become better from it.
Yeah, this is what I would say. There's a lot of what Carter just said, and being open to learn and accepting other people's cultures and differences. And I think especially in the classroom, one thing that really needs to happen is like giving those students, those POC students, like a voice to learn and a voice to speak out, so they can feel like they're having a chance to like show their intelligence and not feel like they're portrayed as like stupid or dumb, or honestly make them feel safe enough to have like that community so they can speak out against any problems they're facing, or even just so they can have a community to talk with, find friends, and build relationships. And I think that's really important to do, and especially in NAACP, our publishers really want to make that, build that connection to other students who are different from us and help them with their problems, and just have a friend in that so they can, you know, have someone to talk to if they ever need help.
Just like Carter said, I'll emphasize listening and learning, and especially respect, because you might not be able to understand what someone's going through, or you might, but you still have to respect them. You can't say that what they said is wrong or it's not exactly right, but you just have to try to respect what they're saying. And I think just listening to what the students have to say is a really big thing, because it's not like we're pulling stuff out of our head. It's stuff that's happening to us. And as a future generation, I think that what we say and what we do is very important. So if we have concerns, I think it's very important to listen to them. And then again, I'll emphasize learning from our mistakes, because if we don't learn from our mistakes, things are just gonna happen again. And I know none of us want that. So I think that those are very good key topics to learn about.
Yeah, this has been, I thank you all for being on this panel with me. I feel like I've learned a lot more than I've given on this panel. And, you know, this has been just great to hear some of the insights from all of you, especially the three of you, and what you're doing, because I feel like that a lot of that is cultural humility. It's the work of it, and especially the institutionalization of it. You know, that's, you know, like Dr. Turbalon said, it's the part that's the hardest, and it's the part that most of us don't want to hear, because, you know, institutionalizing these habits of being critically self-reflective, being clumsy while we're learning about that, understanding power dynamics and our place in it. Our organizations usually don't have a lot of space for that. There's no language for that. And I admire anybody who's just going up there and they're like, you know what, we're going to do it. And I think that's the best way to make it something that we're doing as communities over and over, is this process of understanding our positionality, understanding privilege and marginalization, becoming better at talking about it. Because the more we do it, the better we get, we're talking about it. But like, it's a long process. And, you know, the process takes as long as it takes. Behaviors and attitudes take a long time to change. And, you know, I think that there is victory in that process of it. But, you know, alongside of that, you know, we can always, you know, financially and otherwise support those, you know, diverse-led efforts towards greater equity. There are all kinds of efforts related to ending evictions, or, you know, ending infant mortality disparities, you know, ending criminal justice and school reform and restorative justice measures, being led by, you know, people of color all around, you know, the city and the country. And even if we feel like, you know what, I can't talk about this, I'm still uncomfortable, I don't know, we can always give that. That is itself progress itself. We can always lend our privilege to those spaces. We can always tell everybody we know about these kind of things and say, you know, you should give too, you should attend this too. You know, in that time that we're waiting for ourselves to, you know, become more comfortable and learn and grow, you know, we can also do all this stuff. That's extremely important as well. I mean, you know, when we're talking about looking at racial equity and disparities, you know, transferring that privilege, using that privilege to transfer power is the most demonstrative thing we can do. And you can be as clumsy as you want when you're doing that, and that's okay. So, you know, while we're kind of being clumsy in that one space, we can also do that if we feel like I need to do something. That's something we can do. So.
Again, I think representation matters, and I'll say it again, this idea of premeditated ignorance. Change takes time. So again, I feel as a white male, I'm speaking specifically to the white community as far as what we can do better and what we can do more, is just arrive at the table, be there and listen, and overcome the idea of premeditated ignorance and ask yourself, what can you do? What is in your wheelhouse? What is in your power? I can't change county legislation. I can't change state legislation. Those are way out of my expertise. What I can do is maybe be a shining moment in Carter's educational experience at New Albany High School. Right? That's what I can do. That's what I can do well. And that's the actionable goal that I took. So what you all can do out there is probably going to be different than what I can do. I spoke to one of our board members on the phone yesterday, Mr. Namoff, and he brought up the idea of opening up a mentorship program. That's a very attractive idea to make sure that some of these marginalized students or students who don't feel like they are being benefited from our current state of education. What can you do in your professional world? What can you do in your networking world? Who can you reach out to make sure, because they're the future. These are our future leaders right here sitting with us. And I'm humbled to be a part of this panel along with them, because as I will always say, it's student voice and student choice should matter. And if they are begging for a more global history curriculum or English curriculum, I can tell you, we as an English department, we have, to align with the state test, we put American literature from 11th grade to 10th grade, and we completely revamped the curriculum this year. And we are including many more Asian authors, Asian American authors, Native American Indian authors, African American authors, both male and female. And I think just more exposure to what we can do. I know that my colleagues and I, a couple are in the room, we are working on a DEI community, not only at the K-12 realm, but also at the high school as well. So the work that Mrs. Herman and Mr. Hood are doing at the administrative level for our community and for our school system is incredible. And unfortunately, last year, maybe a year and a half or 2 years ago, was the first of its kind. We're late to the table, but finally we're at the table. So get involved. Get in touch with Superintendent Sawyers, get in touch with the board members. They want to hear your voice. Get in touch with Mrs. Herman or Mr. Hood at the administrative DEI level. They want to hear your ideas, and however you can bring your professionalism to the table to help our students succeed will be your unique set of experience of what you can add to their educational experience. So thank you guys for being here.
Yes, thank you. It does no justice, but thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart for your input. We had a couple list items here too, just being Healthy New Albany. We're a 501c3 nonprofit in the community. We're supported largely by donations and partners. And we really want to use this beautiful space that's gifted to us from partnership through the city and our donors to be an action item for these types of discussions. So whether that's discussion groups that are held here, we want to be that space to provide that space for these discussions to continue. So that is my pledge. However we can support this through this beautiful building in Healthy New Albany, we are committed to doing that. Other things too, I thought about, even just, you know, in my research, I ended up joining the NAACP and subscribing to their newsletters. So just simple things like that we can do just to, and it was so interesting to me to just get the information pushed to my inbox about so many of these beautiful topics that I didn't, you know, really have that breadth and depth of knowledge on, and now it's being delivered to me and I can stay current on it. So I think that's something really simple that each of us could do. And then I would also highlight just the Kirwan Institute. They have really a great, wonderful facilitation and consultation services, so they can go into your businesses and different groups and provide insight and information on how to bring this equity into your workplace or to your community. So the services and resources at Kirwan, you can look online, they're fantastic. So it's a wonderful work to be partnered and have your support on these. Thank you so much. So thank you all for being here. This is really the way of cultural humility, just these discussions in our quest for greater equity. I hope that we can keep having them and stay in touch with us and let us know what you're thinking and feeling. And if there's certainly support, the Black Student Association and the NAACP Youth Unit working on our campus here to bring all of this great work, just bringing these voices and elevating those voices wherever you can. We will certainly do that as well. So thank you. In your packets, anyone digital, you'll get them, anyone virtual, you'll get the packets digitally. It includes the video we watched, as well as all these resources that are in our hard copy packets today. Also coming up for September is Hunger Action Month. So we will actually be on site, instead of here, we'll be at the New Albany Food Pantry, doing a tour and learning about suburban food insecurity for our September Lunch and Learn. In October, we have a great group coming called Heart. They'll set up a bedroom here. It's on substance abuse. So they'll set up a bedroom and help people walk through finding different types of drugs that potentially could be in a child's bedroom. We'll also have the New Albany Plain Local Schools and the New Albany Police Department Resource Officer here. So that will be in October. And then November, we'll be working with the Center for Family Safety and Healing to discuss domestic abuse. And then December, we're going to actually invite all of our speakers from the past year to just come back and have a nice celebration and talk about how much we've learned over the last year. So we will invite you all to that. And I think that's it for today. So thank you all so much.